And with that, let's say the blessing for Torah study. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher
Kirishanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu b'asot b'divrei Torah.
Praise to you, Lord our God, rule the universe, who's made us sway with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. And with that, let's talk about God. All right, Phil, would you read our first text, please? I should make this bigger for everybody.
Yeah, okay.
Right on that.
Yeah, 2 to 4, right? That's the part. Right. Thank you. You must destroy all the sites at which the nations you are to dispossess worshipped their gods, whether on leafy mountains and on hills or under any luxuriant tree. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, put their sacred posts to the fire, and cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from that site. Do not act in this way toward the Lord your God, comma. Okay. Context. This is from the biblical book of Deuteronomy, from a part describing how the Israelites should act when they get into the land of Israel. In context, it is saying that the Canaanites worship their gods all over the place, and the Israelites should only worship their God in the place that God will show you, i.e. Jerusalem. By stopping the text at verse 4, what relevance does this have on the question of erasing and or writing the name of God?
All right, so here's our text. How is this text connected to the idea of erasing the name of God or writing the name of God?
These gods are all icons. They're not a one and only God. It's not our God. But then he doesn't put a hyphen in verse 4 though, does it?
Yes. So
would putting a hyphen in the place of the O in God essentially obliterate his name?
That's an interesting question and a very good point.
I believe that he's saying that just the name itself has the same power as the altars, as the pillars, as the sacred, all those different things. The name of God has the same power as all the other things that people are worshiping for the false idols.
Well, yeah, but they did turn around and put up an altar and had presumably pillars and sacred posts and no images, but they did build the temple.
Is the Hebrew in sentence 4 the same as it is in the context that we saw where they did have the hyphen, or is there,
so here's this Hebrew in sentence 4. Asukin, Ladonai Hechem, Adonai spelled Yud He Vav He.
Yeah.
So I don't usually go into this point, but it is highly relevant to tonight's class about spelling the word God or the name of God with a dash or without a dash. In general, texts on Sepharia spell God G-O-D. In general, anything that I have written, I spell G-D. So,
what I've been taught is that the reason it's G-D is that you don't want to destroy the name of God by tearing out a piece of paper, for example, or burning a piece of paper with God's name spelled out in G-O-D. electronically, which is what Safaria has, you don't really destroy it the same way you do a piece of paper in terms of erasing it or whatever. I don't know if that's why they don't do it.
Well, could it be
a possibility?
Could it be though that it's Safari? I mean, the English here is just repeating what's in the Torah, translated into English. Whereas David, when you write something, it's not the Torah; it's David writing something.
Yeah.
David, why is it important to you to not write G-O-D, but rather to write G-D? Why is that significant to you?
So that's a good question. It's significant to me partly because that's what I've been taught, and partly out of a concern that if I'm writing something, certainly if I'm writing it out in paper, like I'm writing it out physically, then I have been taught that adds more sanctity to the name. And if it's electronic and I send it to you and you print it off, then it becomes something that's been printed with the name of God written on it. In the end, what this comes down to is how do we keep special something that is special? Or how do we keep something that's special, I guess is the better way of putting it. Like if the name of God is special, then how do we keep that special?
You know, I think it might be helpful to have a little historical context for doing this with English words, David. And I thought Herb's question was a really good one. And after all, this is not the name of God in our tradition. It's the word God to translate a Hebrew word. And it didn't used to be the case. I can't speak about how it was done in Orthodox circles, but certainly outside of them, it certainly wasn't done in newspaper articles, ads, and other writings that were very likely to be destroyed when once read in English, because it was just these English words. I don't know when it became something different. Obviously, you learned it differently, but once you go into this, it becomes, as we've I think discussed a little, it becomes an almost infinite regress as you go back and so that, for example, I was listening to something by a Hasidic rabbi, a Chabad rabbi, and he doesn't say Yod Hey Vav Hey, he says Yod K Vav K, as you might imagine. And that's sort of the same infinite regress, but at least he's doing it with Hebrew letters. Actually, he doesn't say Kof, he says K. And actually, some of them won't say that. They'll say Yod and Hey and Vav and Hey. And I think at some point it becomes impossible to write things in English. The advantage of having them in English is that everybody can understand them who read the English. And here we have the Lord, after all, that's a substitution for the Yod Hey Vav Hey, which is another substitution because we say we don't know the vowels, we don't put them in. So I've gone on too long, I'm sorry, but I think a little context about usages might be useful.
Absolutely. Let's go on.
Make a good point, Phil, in that G-O-D in English is a word that we use for God. It's not really his name, and it's only in English. What about other languages? Do they do something similar to using the dash? I would have no idea if they do. I suspect they don't. So why is in English the O? Why do we omit the O in English and put a dash there? What's so special about it in English and not in other languages?
That's a really good question, and I haven't seen it, but I don't do it in English either. So I tend to make a joke of it but I didn't realize it was taught in the Jewish day schools or the Hebrew schools now. I didn't even realize that.
But in concept, it's less conceptually, David, what I heard you say is it's a respect for whatever we choose to call something great, you know, something that's great, something, yeah, specific, a God type, a God entity. And it's that respect that you're trying to protect in your own way from disrespect, and that has meaning to you. Which is, you know, that's a very personal and I think important choice. I'm not sure it makes sense for everybody who doesn't have that same sense, but to me, it makes sense for an individual where that's how they feel about it, and see the concept and the passing on and the fear that it will be desecrated as a way of upholding the sanctity of God, as an important choice that an individual could make, regardless of the historical perspective.
So let's
go
ahead.
In a similar fashion, I wonder, is there a difference between writing Yud Hey Vav Hey with vowels or without vowels, similar to using the O in God or a dash in God? Hebrew, is there a difference?
I think it's possible that there are, you know, a lot of suggestions that are possibilities, but I'd like to suggest something else. You know, it made me think about Adam in the Garden of Eden. He was told he could name all the animals and he would have dominion over them. Something about naming something gives you power over them. And by not naming God, we're admitting that we don't have power over God.
Interesting.
Very, very interesting.
All right, let's go on and see what else there is in the background of the story.
David?
Yes, same.
I've always been curious about why there's the dash, G dash God, because to me, that's not the name of God. That is a category. And it's a category that for some people has many members, if they have many gods, as in this reading in the Torah. For us, it's a category which has one member, but it's still a category. It's not a name. And to my knowledge, God doesn't have a name in English. So, you know, I don't worry about it. You know, God has a Hebrew name. So that's my take on it. So I've never understood the dash.
We also we don't really know what the name is. We just have all these references to the thing we cannot name, right? Yeah,
but in Hebrew, we have a placeholder for the name. We have something that we recognize as the name that we don't pronounce.
But it isn't really the name. I mean, on some level, aren't all these terms that we're talking about a kind of an, I don't know, I guess an equivalent of "Hey you"?
Well, so something that kind of stood out to me also is that, you know, with like what Phil was saying is G-D is what's, you know, sacred in English. So then you use a synonym. And then this is kind of how language progresses, where then the synonym becomes sacred and then you can't use that one. And then another synonym takes its place, where the synonyms are, you know, kind of used for ease of use. And like, even though to get away from, I guess, what you were saying, Ted, like this might not be the official one, but like it just keeps on going down where more and more synonyms kind of sprout up and then kind of end up becoming sacred in their own right, I feel.
At the burning bush, didn't God tell Moses his name as I am that I am? Not Adonai, not God, not Elohim, but I am that I am. And Moses asked him what his name was.
Right.
David, what is the Hebrew word for the lowercase g, God?
So it's related to Elohei, Aleph Lamed Hey of like Elohechem are your gods, or there we go. Elohechem are their gods.
Okay.
Elohenu, our God. Elohecha, your God. Some posit that this may be related to Allah as like the Middle Eastern term for God, or God either with a capital G or lowercase g.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right, let's go into our next text and see what else there is in this situation. Doris, would you read this text, please?
Rav Hanania objects to this, and let the Tana also enumerate one who erases the name of God in the course of his walking and plowing, and its prohibition is from here, and you shall destroy their names. You shall not do so to the Lord your God. Deuteronomy Context. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. Masehet Tractate Makot, which is about crimes for which the punishment is flogging. After the Mishnah lists some of them, Rabbi Hanania argues that erasing the name of God should also be on the list, deriving that from the text in Deuteronomy. What bearing does this have on the question of writing G-D's name with a dash?
Okay, thank you. So in the previous text, bring it up, because by stopping the selection at verse 4, it's saying the rabbis are reading that you should obliterate their name, the pagan god's name, but you should not obliterate the name of God, our God. So they do a selective reading. They cut the context at the end of verse 4 instead of going on. And that's what we see here. So if that's the case, then what does that have to do with the question of writing God's name with a dash or not?
I don't know, seems like if you write it with a dash, you're not going to be obliterating it by either intentionally or accidentally erasing it. It would only be if you had G-O-D.
All right. Let's go into our next text then, Leviticus. Herb, would you read this one, please?
Not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Context. This is from the biblical book of Leviticus, from the Holiness Code in chapter 19. The chapter says, you shall be holy to the Lord your God, and then proceed to list a set of ways to interact with other people in a holy manner. The idea of a stumbling block before the blind has been interpreted more broadly to include not putting wine out at Kiddush when you know there are children or alcoholics present. If the prohibition is on erasing the name of God, how might this text be relevant to the question of writing the name of God? Well, still raises the point that, is G-O-D the name of God? And if it is, does putting a dash in amount to obliterating the name? I wish I had an answer to that.
I think that if you haven't, if G-O-D were the name of God, and you wrote it out and then erased the O and put a dash, then you might make, then one could argue that that's obliterating the name of God. If you haven't written it in the first place, then you are writing two English letters with a dash in between. Would be a narrower answer to the question of obliterating the name of God.
When, in an abstract way, one might argue that both G-O-D and G-D are symbols for a concept, an idea, an entity, whatever, however you believe in that. And either one are equally desecrated if they get destroyed, because they're both just words that are abstract, are ways of representing the concept.
Yeah, I feel like the real question is, what is the name of God? And, like, where does it, like, is G-O-D that, or L-O-R-D, or I am, or, like all these different things. So where does one become the one that is his English name and not?
It seems to me that G-O-D is not the name of God, but the name of God is, name of God, those 9 letters and the spaces, that's the name of God. So you don't want to write out all of those 9 letters in English as, without some kind of modification to them. Thus they put the dash in the middle of the third word. Because there's other, I'd have to scroll up to see if this point makes sense, but there's other places where the word God is used without name of God, and there's no dash in the middle. So it's like name of God is what can't be written out. The word God by itself, used in other contexts, seems to be written out in a variety of places. Does that make sense?
The last 3 words were the name of capital H, him, would you have to put a dash for the I and say H-M?
Oh, that's interesting. I would say yes.
Because we use him as referring to God the same way we used capital G-O-D, if you will, as referring to God.
I'm sorry.
No, you got it, Phil.
Oh, thanks. I wanted to suggest maybe a simplification of what we seem to be falling into here. The rabbis, after all, in the Mishnah, we're not talking about English names. They were talking presumably about what they wrote in Hebrew. Maybe they translated them into Aramaic sometimes, but in terms of their text, and that's a hard enough problem just on its own. So if we look at that, and we say that you don't put out the wine as a stumbling block for the alcoholics, and you don't put out the name of God needlessly, because people might destroy it or put it on and use it as a napkin or something and wipe their mouth on it, God forbid. And so there are all these restrictions with that in mind. Now, I would want to give a different example if I could, because at Har Zion, for example, partly because of the text of the Siddur, we now have the word Adonai instead of Lord, and I guess that's supposed to be reflective of the Hebrew that we have. But because of the way I was brought up, I find it very uncomfortable throwing that word around and only use it, generally speaking, as a in the context of prayer. And that doesn't make me more pious, I'll tell you that. But it is a question of a sensibility about what you do. So I'd be much more comfortable saying Hashem and not spelling out this Hebrew word, even though that Hebrew word is itself a substitute for the, the unvocalized four-letter name. But that's where I am.
Thanks, Phil. Justin, what were you going to say?
Oh, nothing of import right now. So let's just keep it going.
In that case, you can read the next text, please.
Oh, me?
Yes, you.
Oh, okay, cool. Rav Acha Bar Hana raised an objection. It is stated in Megillat Tanait. Yes? Tanit. On the 3rd of Tishrei, the ordinance required the mention of God's name in legal documents was abolished, and on the day fasting is forbidden. For the kingdom of Greece had issued a decree against the Jews, forbidding them to mention the name of heaven on their lips. When the Hassaminian kingdom became strong and defeated the Greeks, they instituted that people should mention the name of heaven even in their legal documents. And therefore they would write in year such and such of Yochanan, the high priest of the God Most High. And when the sages heard about this, they said, tomorrow this one, the borrower will repay his debt. The lender will no longer need to save the loan document. The document will be cast on a dunghill, and the name of heaven written there will come to disgrace. And so they annulled the ordinance to mention God's name in documents, and they made that day into a festival. And if it enters your mind to say that Megillat Ta'anit had been nullified, can you say that the first prohibitions against fasting they annulled, and the later ones were added? Context. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Mesachat Rosh Hashanah, which is about Rosh Hashanah, as you might presume. This text is from the Gemara, commenting on a Mishnah that says that the new moon was announced throughout the land of Israel and the diaspora, so that people would know when to observe the holiday and fast days. The Gemara picks up on the matter of fast days and eventually raises the question about Megillat Ta'anit, not the same as Mishnah Ta'anit. Megillat Ta'anit was a scroll that listed noteworthy days when fasting was therefore forbidden. The question is whether this list of dates is still in force. In this text, the following happens. 1, the Syrian Greeks forbid the Jews to say God. 2, the Maccabees beat the Syrian Greeks and say that the Jews should say God and even write it in the business documents. Take that, Syrian Greeks. 3, the rabbis worry that people will throw away their business documents and disgrace God's name, so they cancel the Hassaminian law about writing God's name on business documents. This happened in the 3rd of Tishrei. 4, the 3rd of Tishrei becomes noteworthy because God's name had been protected, so it's included on a list of dates when one shouldn't fast. Note that the 3rd of Tishrei is a minor fast day, and it was even when this discussion is happening. See Rosh Hashanah 18, B5. It is Som Gedaliah, the day that the last Judean in charge of the land of Israel was assassinated. If we don't write God's name where it might be discarded or erased, does that mean that we should spell God with a dash?
Okay, thank you. That was a lot of reading. All right, so is it clear what happened in this situation? Syrian Greeks said Jews can't say God. The Maccabees say Jews should say God and even write it on their business documents. The rabbis are worried that people will throw away their business documents and disgrace God's name, so they cancel the law about writing God's name on business documents. And then this becomes, what?
That's crazy.
Didn't the rabbis, weren't they in conflict with the Hassaminian Jews? I mean,
also true.
Jews. I think I remember that from our classes.
Yes, it is also true that the rabbis and the Hassaminians do not get along well with each other.
So they're saying, don't write the name of God so that you can throw out business documents. But I thought at some point, I don't know if it was law or custom, that just any documents in Hebrew got saved in Genizas, which is why the Cairo Geniza was such a font of information, because everything was saved if it was ever written in Hebrew, even if it was a business document.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that at some point, I don't know if it was custom or law, but at some point, what people did changed?
Yes. And then it changed again. I don't know for sure, but I will see if I can find out more about what was happening in the case of the Cairo Geniza. I will also say that that points to a question today about how we get rid of documents that have God's name on them, and whether you can recycle those documents or not. I was going to make that part of this class and then realized that that would make this class way too long. So I will include it as a separate source sheet when I send out the notes from this week's class about whether or not you can recycle the name of God or not, and under what conditions.
Raises the point about today, we bury things like Siddurim, and when you bury something and the earth and the water reach it, doesn't God's name get obliterated, get erased?
Yes. And it's considered a more respectful way if that's going to happen, more respectful to do it that way than to throw it, as they say, on the dunghill.
David, doesn't this go back to the whole idea of, the putting the fence around the Torah, so that, so I mean, God's name would certainly be part of that, so that you want to protect it from being, demeaned in any way,
Yeah. Yes, this is very much a case of fences around the Torah. And right now we're still, in our texts, we're still talking about like the Hebrew name of God. We haven't even gotten to G-D as far as our texts are concerned. But yes, you're right. This is very much a case of fences for protection.
So this story, by the way, side note, it reminds me kind of how politically, like the far left and the far right are more like a horseshoe, and they kind of come together on the same side, because the Syrian Greeks are like, don't use the name of God, because I assume they didn't like Jews. And the rabbis were like, don't use the name of God, but for, like a different reason, but like where it kind of, they're on completely different sides of the scale, but kind of reach the same thing. I don't know. I just think it's interesting.
It is a good observation.
Yeah.
All right. Alan Paris, would you please read our next text from Shavuot?
Okay. Is that to say that gracious and compassionate are sacred names? The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Baraita. There are names of God that may be erased, and there are names of God that may not be erased. due to their inherent sanctity. These are names that may not be erased. For example, several variations of the name God, the name God, Elohim. I guess the variations El, Elohecha, with the second person singular suffix, Elohim, Elohechem, with the second person plural suffix. I shall be as I shall be. Aleph Dalet Yod Hey, Almighty, Shaddai, Lord of Hosts, Tzivaot. These names may not be erased. Context. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Masachet Shavuot, which is about oaths, not about the holiday Shavuot. There is no tractate about Shavuot. The question under discussion is when witnesses take an oath using God's name, which names of God make them liable for breaking the third of the 10 Commandments, not to swear falsely using God's name. To help answer that question, the Gemara brings a Baraita, text that didn't make it into the Mishnah. Baraitas are like Hamantash dough that don't get into the circles. The Baraita says that certain names of God are so holy that they can't be erased, and other ways of referring to God can. What bearing does this have on the question of spelling God with a dash?
I personally think that, like, kind of what I've been saying with, that was from the Babylonian Talmud, and those were the names at that time that were used, that were important and could not be erased. But over time, a synonym becomes what is used in the common phrase, and then that becomes the thing that represents God most likely. Like, God was not used, G-O-D was not used back then, but now it is the word that is used to represent it. So, like, the way that language progresses, there's always going to be a name that eventually, or a word that eventually becomes the one that is the most holy or sacred, depending on what it is. And then that one is going to be the one that you can't be erased. And then another synonym is going to come in, and then eventually the cycle is going to kind of continue. And so that's where where does it stop? Where does it begin, really?
What is the word today that we use that cannot be erased?
G-O-D, and it wasn't used back at that time. It wasn't, that technical word was not used in this text right there. But now it is, and it's, that's what this whole class is about, us not erasing that word.
If we look at all the places G-O-D is used today in this country, you honestly think that it's possible that all those documents would not have the word erased, or would all those documents use the dash?
Well, I think that those documents in the country are probably maybe not be referring to the same G-O-D that we might be referring to, possibly.
And conceptually, Justin, what I think you're saying is that in each time, I would individualize it for individuals too. Different things come to represent that which is most sacred. And that's what you should hold dear, carefully, and protect in whatever ways you choose to do so. The problem is where different people hold that thing or hold it using different terms, etc. It's the debate over the American flag and burning or not, how you handle the American flag and things. Some things become symbolic, and to your point, God, capital G, to a Jew within our faith has a very specific meaning, and that's what you're saying today, for many, holds that special place. We heard earlier one of our groups say Adonai holds that place. Not an English word, but one we use certainly enough. And it's that concept, I think, David, you spoke about at the very beginning, that it's this concept that why it's so important to you, that there's something so, so important to you in terms of how it means and what it means, that its sanctity must be upheld.
So this is one of the interesting things about texts. You can look at this text. There are names of God that may be erased, and there are names of God that may not be erased. And you can come to two opposite conclusions based off of it. You could say, G-O-D is not on this list. Ergo, you can write it without a dash because there's no problem with erasing it. You could also look at this text and say, these names were the important names of the time. Nowadays, G-O-D is our important name in our country. Therefore, same text, you shouldn't erase it. So we come to two different conclusions. Touching on one of the points that was brought up a few minutes ago, we have something from Maimonides who has something to say on the matter. Ted, would you read this text, please?
If a heretic, even though an Israelite, wrote a scroll of the Torah, such book must be burned together with the mentioned names therein, because he believes not in the sacredness of the name, and surely did not write it in God's name, but thought of it merely as of secular matters, and because his mind was such, no name therein was sanctified. Context. This comes from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, where he reorganizes the Talmud's rules into more organized categories. Here, Maimonides is saying that we shouldn't burn Torah scrolls, but if there was no intention of divine holiness when writing the names of God, then it's only a pretend Torah. This text is relevant to the question of bringing a dollar bill into a bathroom, not because people at the US Mint are heretics, but because there is no intention of the sanctity of God when they print "In God We Trust." How is this relevant to our discussion about writing God's name with a dash?
This is really brilliant. And you here he is saying the just taking this text in by itself, that the intention controls, and here that the heretic didn't have the requisite intention. So we in fact not only may destroy it, but we really should, rather than be confused and having an unkosher Torah scroll that people could be using. And so much turns on the individual's subjective stance. And you could push that in many directions, but it's to me, it's just very, it's just full of possibilities, like with the money. Or of course, to many people, money is a sacred thing that raises different questions.
Let's go on to our next text. I want to be respectful of people's times. Gary, would you read this text from Mishnah Torah, please?
Sure. 4, tablets on which scriptures are written for a child's instruction have no sanctity. Context. This is again Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. Here he is discussing which objects have holiness and can't just be thrown away when you are done with them. Along the way, he brings a ruling from the Talmud, Megillah 32a, that a chalk tablet has no holiness, and that it is okay to write and erase God's name on such a tablet, since the nature of the tablet is to be erased. How is this relevant to writing God's name with a dash on an electronic device?
Thank you. These are two separate, so there are two related issues here. One, on just typing G-O-D, capital G-O-D on like a word processing document. And two, the fact that anytime you scroll, you have technically erased everything that was there and re-put it somewhere else. So, how is Maimonides' ruling relevant today?
Well, you put somewhere else in a series of 0 and 1s and not a name, a series of numbers.
And depending on how the code is written, whenever you're scrolling, you're not technically probably erasing the base code of the GOD. It might just be moving lines on it.
I would think scrolling on a screen is kind of like flipping the pages of a book. I mean, when you flip from one page to the next, you haven't erased what's on the previous page. It's still there. The same with scrolling.
I think that by making this analogy that, well, that a chalk tablet has no holiness, and that it's okay to write and erase God's name on such a tablet, since the nature of a tablet is to be erased. And I would think that, you know, writing on a computer is very much the same, because you're writing on things that basically can disappear, you know, by the click of a button. And so I think, you know, the issue of God's name on a computer maybe is similar to a chalk tablet.
I enter the entire Torah in my computer and then print it out. Is that hard copy holy? As holy as a Torah?
So that's related to the other sheet that I will send to you guys about when can you recycle something with God's name on it, and when do you have to bury it? And it gets to the question of if it's permanent or not. I see it's 9 o'clock. With your permission, I'd like to touch on the other 3 things that are left in here, because I think it will, not the appendices, but the other 3 things, because I think it'll help wrap this up. So the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is the conservative movement's decision-making body. And they had a question about should the branches of conservative movement write out the full word God, or should they use G-D? And so their answer is, they go through this, you can see it on your own when I send it to you, but here's the conclusion. The practice of writing the full word God and other names of God in the vernacular has clear precedent and justification in the halakha. It is therefore permissible for national conservative organizations to follow this practice. So, in the end, this comes down to this text from Eruvin, that for 3 years, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagreed. They both said the halakha is goes along with us. And finally, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. So you're right and you're right. Either way, you've got justification in this situation. And in conclusion, this is the first time I've ever actually written a conclusion with a verdict. But here's my conclusion based off of going through all this. The problem is erasing, or otherwise disrespectfully treating, the printed out name of God. Putting a dash in G-D is an extra fence, so that if somebody were to print it out, and if they were to then throw it out, the name of God would be just a tad less desecrated.
Oh.
Here are the issues in order of severity. The biggest thing you should not do is erase or desecrate one of the Hebrew names of God written with the intention of holiness. The next biggest thing you shouldn't do is erase or desecrate one of the Hebrew names of God written without the intention of holiness. Then you should, then the next issue is writing one of the Hebrew names of God in a text that will not definitely be treated with respect. So like, if we're not talking about a permanent object like a Siddur, Chumash, or Torah scroll, but like a source sheet, printed out source sheet, that's not quite as bad as one of the other issues. Then writing out the full English name of God in a text that will not be treated with respect. At this point, some authorities are like, whatever, if it's in English, doesn't matter. And others are like, no, if it's in English, still matters. And then finally, typing, not writing, but typing the full English name of God. So basically what this comes down to is if you choose to write out the name of God with an O, great. And if you choose to write it with a dash, great. Either way, you're okay. Try to, if you come across a printed out hard copy form of it, try to treat it with respect.
And if you write it with intention and the reader reads it without intention, or vice versa, you've really got a dilemma.
Yes.